Thank you, everybody, and thank you for your patience with our tech issues. This is 21st century Buddhism at its finest. So I've been asked to give the talk today in Nettie's absence. I want to talk about a recent pilgrimage I did to the Buddhist holy sites in India. So, for those of you that don't know, when the Buddha died in his final sutra, or his final talk to the monks, he answered a question about, how do we keep inspiration when you're gone? And he answered it in a way where he encouraged his practitioners to visit 4 particular sites that were important to him in his life. Those were Lumbini, where he was born, Bodh Gaya, where he sat under the Bodhi tree and first realized his full being, Saranath, where he gave his first sermon to the group of 5 monks that had previously abandoned him and then came back and became the first Sangha. And I apologize, I disconnected again. I apologize. So I'll continue where I left off.
Can you record the talk as a voice memo on your phone so people can listen to it later as well?
Sure, that's not a bad idea. I'll try that. Apologies.
Just in case.
Yes. All right. So I was saying the holy site given and set up as places where people could go. And it was set up as places holy in themselves. It didn't say, I was born here, therefore this is the greatest place on the face of the planet. The Buddha encouraged people to go on pilgrimage to these sites as a source of inspiration. So it's quite different from how you might think of pilgrimage.
Nice.
Thank you, and apologies for the technical issues. People hear me through this one now. Yes.
Yes, we can hear
I
you.
think I can see some nod. Yep, great. So sorry about that. So as I was saying, the Buddhist pilgrimage sites are different to how you think of pilgrimage in a kind of a more monotheistic or maybe some of the more Judeo-Christian religions that we're familiar with. So it's not the holy city of Mecca. It's not it's not Jerusalem where Jesus was. It's places that are imbued with the spirit of Buddha, and that Buddha, the historical Buddha, went to and was part of. But it's also about your own practice there. Going to these pilgrimage sites is about finding a way to connect with these places for yourself, not just to be in the place where this guy hung out. So I recently, over the summer, went to 3 of the 4 Buddhist holy sites in India. So I'd already been to Lumbini in Nepal in the past, and I went to Bodh Gaya, Saranath, and Kushinagar. And each of them had a very different energy. they all brought something different. And when I went there, I tried to go with the mind to find what I could find for my own practice in each of these places. It is valuable and important to go and pay respects, to see the Bodhi tree in the Mahabodhi temple, and prostrating oneself in front of it is a wonderful thing that you can do. But I tried not to see it as a sense of veneration, but as a sense of inspiration, as the Buddha encouraged us to do. Perhaps the first thing to say about going on pilgrimage to these places is that they exist in modern-day India, and modern-day India it's a wonderful, chaotic, energetic, and very particular kind of place. I think a lot of us might have this image in our head of a Buddhist pilgrimage as something very peaceful and relaxing. You're going to just sit and hear the sounds of the birds and the winds and not be interrupted. And then you get to India, and the most common sound is a car horn blaring, which happens every 3 seconds on average, seemingly incapable of driving down the road without leaning on the horn. I was staying in a Tibetan centered place, a retreat center, which was actually a little out of town, so it was a little bit quieter. So there were maybe only 4 nights when wedding parties blasted techno music into 2 a.m. in the morning. And yet there is this energy in that. There's an energy in being alive in these places. One of my first reflections going to India was, obviously it's probably changed in 2,000 years, but even at the time of the Buddha, I imagine there's this sense at which I can understand why some of these teachings arose in this place. It's a part of the world where, in order to just exist in that part of the world with 1.5 billion people there, you have to assert yourself a little bit. That the natural way of doing things is to stamp your authority on a space and say, this is me, this is mine, I've got to really persist here. And we all know the kinds of suffering that come with that kind of an attitude. And so I can understand why teachings of trying to get us to undo some of those self-assertions, trying to get us to let go of the self, I can understand why they arose in that context, because people would have been, even back then, suffering in the ways that we suffer now out of this, get out of my way kind of attitude that is kind of natural in that place. One of the things that I noticed first about Bodh Gaya too is it is alive with every kind of Buddhism you can imagine. So Buddhism is diverse. It's a lot of people think of Buddhism as one thing, particularly from the West, but it's not. It's 5, 6, 7 different traditions, and in Bodh Gaya especially, they all come together. There are the Tibetans over there doing their 108 prostrations. There are the Koreans over there. There are the Thais with their chanting and big gold monasteries. There are the Japanese monasteries that are a little bit more subdued and bang a lot of drums, and everyone does their own thing, but they do it in harmony and in concert with each other. And you walk into the Mahabodhi temple in particular, past the 2 layers of security that are really there to stop you bringing your phone in, which is quite nice actually. And you feel that happening all at once. It's all there, and everyone is bringing their own flavor of Buddhism there. And you can sit and you can listen to a talk by a Thai monk, and then also listen a little bit over to your left and hear the chanting of the Tibetan lamas, and it's wonderful. There's that vividness and color in it all, and everyone is just moving together. As I said, I stayed in a predominantly Tibetan retreat center, and there was a Tibetan retreat going on at the time. I did not expect to be learning about Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism on my trip to Bodh Gaya, but I did. I learnt more about that practice than I had ever learnt about it in the past. I was a bit surprised when I rocked up to meditation and someone kept talking the whole time. It's how they do it. And everyone in those places understands that everyone else in those places is there for inspiration. So you have conversations with people. I made some lovely friends, particularly at the Japanese temple. I went there as, part of a Zen tradition, so it made sense too. And, as soon as someone, eyeballed you and saw your rakusu and went, oh, you're also kind of in the same group as me, there's an immediate bond, I now know a monk who runs a monastery near the airport in Tokyo. I've got an offer to stay there whenever I want. It's nice. There's a way in which Bodh Gaya in particular can often, it came across as like a sense of practice in community. The Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree by himself, having been left by his companions, and yet now it's the full sense of community there. And there's a wonderfulness to the history of it too. So around Bodh Gaya there are some additional pilgrimage sites which are not in the big four, but they are also quite interesting and useful. And these really add more color to the story of the Buddha. You can go to the cave where he practiced for years his ascetic practices. You cross the river, and I don't know if many people know the traditional story of the Buddha when he first accepted milk rice from Sujata and broke his ascetic practices. But as I heard it, the story goes, he's crossing the river and is so weak he can't cross the river, and so Sujata comes to him and gives him some milk and helps give him strength. And I always had in my head, I was like, if he was that weak, why was he trying to cross a river? That's like really deep and quite hard. What is he doing? And then you go to Bodh Gaya and you realize that for 8 months of the year, the river is actually empty. That particular river only fills up for a few months every year. And you just go, oh, of course, he's just crossing the river at a time when there's no water in it. And it's written like that, but you don't understand that until you're there and you see that. Near Bodh Gaya, there's also Vulture's Peak, where the Heart Sutra was expounded. And so you can go up there and you can see the cave that Sariputra and Ananda stayed in. You can go to the top of Vulture's Peak and look out and see where the spot where the historical Buddha first preached the Heart Sutra. You can go to another university where hundreds of years of Buddhist teachers have taught and see the history there. And so there are all these places that not only hold a historical significance, but they also give you an opportunity to think about your own practice in the context of the various things you're doing. One of the things that I thought a lot about in Bodh Gaya was motivation. This is a place where somebody really practiced for years and years and years and walked the path and uncovered the path from the undergrowth. And the level of dedication and motivation that must take was something that really hit me. And I spent my time there reflecting on my own motivations. What's driving me? What do I want to do in my practice? If you go there, you'll probably land on some other different thought that you have around your own practice, and that'll be the right thing for you to think there. From Bodh Gaya, I went over to Saranath, which is near the historical city of Varanasi, very, very close to Varanasi. It's actually pretty much a suburb of it. And Saranath was interesting. It was different. It was more set up like an archaeological site. There wasn't that same, there wasn't a central stupa or temple that everyone went to. There was a big kind of stupa that had been built, but it was a historical one, and there was a big archaeological museum, and it was very interesting. But yet it was also, you could see the ways in which the different Buddhist communities were interacting with that place. In Saranath, there weren't as many Tibetans for whatever reason. They were hugely predominant in Bodh Gaya, and they weren't really there in Saranath. And so you came across more of the Sri Lankan and Thai pilgrim groups that had come over from Sri Lanka and Thailand and were in these massive groups that would sit and meditate by the stupas and would walk around and engage with it. I stayed at a Japanese temple, not a Zen temple, a different Japanese temple in Saranath, and it's almost like this is one of those temples. I forgot the name of the sect exactly, but they do a lot of kind of paying homage to the Lotus Sutra, and every morning their meditation is just to hit drums and chant that over and over again. And it was interesting there because that felt like every day they put on a show for people. There were local Indians and also other pilgrims who'd come and just watch what was going on, and they wouldn't necessarily participate, but they would just watch. And you get these different Buddhist communities kind of showcasing how they practice and what they do. In Saranath, I took the inspiration prompt to think about the concept of joy. And Saranath is where the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths, the first teaching that he gave to his group of monks. The truth of suffering and the way out. And it felt like the right place to think about joy, to think about the inverse of that, how our practice generates joy. What is joy? What kind of joy do we generate? And again, it's just a very personal practice thing for me. I don't necessarily think everyone should go to Saranath and think about joy or suffering or these things, but it was just where I was at. And it just flowed. I didn't rock up to these places thinking, I'm going to think about this. I rocked up to these places and I sat there for a day and just went, what is hitting me? What is this inspiring in me? Varanasi itself is a very, very interesting city. It's very holy in the Hindu tradition as a city of Shiva and the god of destruction. You destroy the things to allow new things to grow, like a bushfire. And there's something about Saranath that is inherently linked with Varanasi. It's much quieter than Varanasi, that's for sure, the city proper, but it has an energy to it that does feel very much like a renewal, like starting again. The new shoots coming up from the ground. And then from Saranath, I went to Krishnagara, where the Buddha died. And Krishnagara was probably the most peaceful of them all. It's the furthest away from a major city, which helps. And there's a big kind of grounds with a central temple in it, a big statue of the Buddha lying down. And these groups of pilgrims all come in chanting and praying in their own languages and carrying these big bolts of cloth, which they effectively use as blankets, and they put over the lying down Buddha as he's there. And I sat there and I watched for hours as various groups came in, laid their cloth over the Buddha. It's almost like everyone's kind of putting him to sleep, tucking him in. It's wonderful. The Chinese group comes in, tuck him in. The Thai group comes in, tuck him in. Then two groups come in at the same time, and there's a bit of a jostle over who gets to tuck him in first. It's a wonderful practice, and it's a very peaceful place, and it's tiny in Krishnagara. The temple room where the lying Buddha statue is, it's no bigger than the room we're in now. It's not like Bodh Gaya is this huge Mahabodhi temple. It's small. And everyone goes in and pays their respects and goes out, and some people sit around the edge and meditate. And it's not a sad place. We think about the Buddha's death. We think about this great teacher that so many people venerated. it's written that the Sangha was sad when the Buddha died, but this feels like it's a place of letting go, where you drop what you're holding on to. I was reading the Diamond Sutra at the time, and so I spent my time there reflecting on a lot of what was in that, a lot of these ways of thinking and frameworks of which we understand things. And that felt as almost like a culmination of a lot of the teachings that I'd been working through. That it's take all the little strings and you put them together in one place into this perfection of wisdom, as it's stated in the Diamond Sutra. And all of these places they're unique and they're personal. And they're holy. They absolutely are holy, but they're holy because people make them holy. Because we bring our practice to these places. It was interesting reflecting on this pilgrimage in India in the context of having been on a very, very different kind of pilgrimage in Japan, where, I walked around an island that was associated with a particular holy figure, the monk Kukai. But that was a very different experience. It was the act of walking and doing that felt like it was a much bigger part of the practice, and the pilgrimage was a practice in itself there. Whereas visiting the sites in India, you're not walking between them, and I guess you could, but most people don't. And so it's about visiting these sites and seeing these things and being in these places, and they're very, very different experiences. And I don't think one is better than the other. But I think as practitioners, one of the things the Buddha teaches us is that the practice is what matters. And you can make a pilgrimage out of anything. There are people who walk through the bush in Australia, and you can turn that into a pilgrimage if you bring a mind of practice to that. And there are people who, it's not what I would want to do, but there are people who might want to go visit these great big metropolitan cities in the world. And you can make a pilgrimage out of that if you bring your practice to it. And it's a lot easier to bring your practice to visiting the sites that the Buddha was at, because obviously the Buddha was there and pretty key to our practice. But it is that bringing of practice that makes those sites holy. There's nothing inherent about them. I remember my Japanese monk friend meeting him at the Bodhi tree one day, and he turned to me and he says, "This is perhaps one of the holiest sites in the world, the center of the universe for Buddhism. And it's also just a tree." That it is just a tree. People run around collecting Bodhi leaves that fall from the Bodhi tree and preserving them as relics. And that Bodhi tree is, I think, great-grandson or some kind of, link to the original Bodhi tree. So there's a lineage there. That's real. But it's a tree. It's a very nice tree. But it's just a tree. And it's what we bring to it that makes it something special. I would encourage everybody to see these places if you can. Certainly, if you're choosing between a party resort in Bali or Buddhist pilgrimage sites in India, I think one of those will probably support your practice more. But I think it's okay if we can't. There are lots of people who can't go to these sites, and in some religions, in Islam, going to Mecca is something one must do in their lives. It's not like that for us. We don't have to do these things. We can, And if it's possible, I think we should. But the reason why we should is because it inspires practice in us. It's because it brings to mind these things that we can take away. Since I've come back, I've been surprised by the amount of things that I picked up on that pilgrimage to India that I wasn't even aware of at the time. Little ways of being, ways of practice that I'm just noticing in myself, that because of all the chaos that was going on in India, I wasn't as fully switched on to. And so I definitely found something there and took it and have brought it with me. But it's also very possible to do these pilgrimages just as spiritual tourism, and you probably wouldn't necessarily get as much. I'm sure that there are tour groups that just go one side a day, 4 days, that's it, you're done. And I think that's lovely to do if that's all you have time for. But just seeing the sights for the sake of seeing the sights is, it's interesting. If you're interested in Buddhist history, it's a great thing to do, but it's not quite the depth of practice that the Buddha wanted to inspire in us by visiting these places. So when we go to these places, if we can do it with the mind that the Buddha asked us to bring to it, that of seeking inspiration, seeking motivation, I think we get a lot more from that. But then again, that's true of everything in life, isn't it? Not sure I have too much more to say on this, but if there are any questions, I would love to hear them. I'll try and plug in the microphone and see how we're going. Our tech issues may preclude us from this today, but we shall see. We shall try. This side. Okay, is that microphone picking up? Yes, it sounds like it is. All right. Any questions in the room? Yes.
Thank you for the talk. That was really fascinating and great to hear about. I'm wondering, you mentioned the experience of being in modern India and so on, and spiritual tourism and so on. I mean, I know in plenty of other sort of temples and religious sites and so on, there's hordes of people just taking photos, and it's an interesting mix of pilgrims or serious people and tourists taking selfies and things like that. I'm just wondering, was that present in more or less in any of the particular sites?
Thank you. Did everyone hear that question online? Yeah, great. So one of the things I think I mentioned in passing, but I really liked about Bodh Gaya, is they had armed guards telling you to not bring your phone. So they had these security things you had to put your bag in and scan it through and all that kind of thing. And, so there weren't a lot of selfies going on there, which is really nice. They have lockers they can give you for free when you put your phone in, so it's all fine. But, so I felt like Bodh Gaya did a fairly good and deliberate job of not leaning itself into that. And I saw a couple of people who I felt like were there as tourists rather than necessarily spiritual seekers, but also that's okay. If we are people who believe that the Dharma is a wonderful thing to share with people, then anywhere on that journey is a valid place for someone to engage. So if I'm from Europe and I've never heard of Buddhism before, and I come to India and I hear about this Buddhist place and I don't know anything else, and so I rock up in my shorts and singlet and go and get in and just gawk at the statue a little bit. I mean, if that's my first interaction, that's okay. But yes, it was in particular that place did help with that without the phones allowed. Saranath did feel a little bit more like a tourist setup. Just had that vibe to it a little more. Kushinagar I think is quite out of the way, so very few people go there unless they're Buddhist pilgrims. It's not the kind of place that it's India, so it's a 6-hour detour from anywhere else to get to Kushinagar. So that one felt a little bit less like that, just I think just because of how hard it is to get there. But yeah, I personally I'm quite okay with spiritual tourism if that is what people need to engage with it. You know, I personally like to have deeper practice experiences and engage with these places in a more practice-based way. But you know, horses for courses, as they say, right? If that's what you need, that's what you need. Tony,
Read.
yeah. See if I can.
You've read Mingyi Rinpoche's book In Love with the World. At Kushinagar, he almost died in the temple grounds from sleeping there and having food poisoning. Talking about spiritual tourism, did you find that spot?
So yes, Tony's referring to a wonderful book which I would recommend to anyone. He put me onto this when we met up in Japan. It's In Love with the World from Mingyi Rinpoche. Did I find that spot? So I certainly had the thought of that book at a few places. One of them, when I went to visit Mingyi's temple in Bodh Gaya, and I went, oh, this is where he got the taxi, and this is where he escaped, and ran down the road to the train stations. Then I actually went to that train station and caught a train there, and so there's a few little spots as a fan of that book. I was like, oh, this is where this happened. I don't think I found the exact spot in Kushinagar. I did find he refers to the toilets and being quite sick in the toilets, so I found them. And I think he does mention he goes to the charnel grounds, the cremation grounds in that town, and that's where he's having his real unwell sickness. There is actually the cremation stupa of the Buddha, so the place where the Buddha supposedly was cremated. I went there, but I couldn't quite find the exact spot he was referring to in that. But look, it's a lovely place to get sick if you're going to do it. Does anyone online have any questions?
Yeah, I'd like to, not so much a question as just really appreciate you sharing the story that I've never heard before, that at Kushinagar people put cloths over the reclining Buddha. It just feels so lovely that the people today are caring for the Buddha. Can you hear me all right? Feels like you can't hear me.
I can hear you very faintly.
Ah,
I heard that you think it's very lovely that people today are caring for the Buddha with putting the cloths over
yeah,
the top. Is that what
yeah.
you're saying?
That's the essence of what I'm saying, yes. Thank you for sharing that.
Yes, thank you. So for those in the room, Nettie was just commenting on how lovely it was that people are still caring for the Buddha today by putting the cloths over the top. Lauren.
Thanks, Taisen. So you mentioned different, like there being a Japanese temple there and a Korean and Tibetan and so on. This might be a silly question, but are there practicing Indian Buddhists who are maintaining these temples, or is it all kind of, it's Buddhism in India kind of moved on and then it doesn't exist anymore there?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Buddhism is not a massive religion in India these days. It's certainly a lot smaller comparatively than it would have been historically. Yeah, I think a lot of reasons for that, but the Mughals coming in and establishing Islam as a very major religion in India probably was a factor, as was the kind of the rise of Hinduism and how that's been growing. So most of the temples run by various kind of countries, or the community-based temples, they tend to operate, if they can, with someone from that community as the head or leading that temple. So the Thai temple has a Thai monk there, the Japanese temple had a Japanese monk there. They certainly have local Indians as caretakers and people who essentially kind of upkeep those temples. They're not always practicing in that tradition, doing that. For a lot of those people, it's a job. I stayed at a temple in Kushinagar. It was a Chinese temple that was run by a local Indian caretaker, and he was a lovely person, but he also tried to charge me twice what he said he was going to charge me at the end of it, and also was renting out the temple grounds for parties to make money on the side. And I'm sure that was something he was very comfortable with doing, but it had a different vibe than I think would have had if it had been run by monastics or people who were kind of more heavily involved in that. A lot of these temples for different countries are set up specifically for the pilgrims of that country. So one of the things that I noticed is, for example, you can't stay at the Thai temple unless you're Thai. Like, they just will kind of just say no and reject you because they're just there. The reason they're there is to house Thai pilgrims, that kind of thing. There are other temples that don't do that. So there are the temples that take kind of anyone, but they are often very associated with the governments of that country and with kind of, the ministry of religion in that various country that is there to kind of set them up and run them for those reasons. So yeah, there's a mix of both Indians and diaspora communities running it, but yeah, Indiaism is not what it once was, and I think there is some movements going on to try and kind of bring it back and to return Buddhism to its kind of historical home, but I'm not sure. I've not stayed across how successful those movements have been. Shogya.
Like Lady, I'm fascinated with this putting the Buddha to bed, and I'm just wondering about the logistics of that. This competition almost that you were saying. One comes in, dresses the bed, and then what happens? They take theirs away, and the next group come in.
Yeah. So there's a couple of monks that are kind of, I guess, maintaining the Buddha's sleeping arrangements. So yeah, they'll allow a few blankets to go on, a few big cloths to go on, and then when it gets too much, they'll take them all off and clear it out, and then I guess kind of roll them up and put them in a corner somewhere. Actually, in Bodh Gaya, they have a central Buddha statue in the Mahabodhi temple, which people donate robes to, and they clothe the seated Buddha statue in these golden robes a lot of the time. And there, actually, what they do is when they take them off, they'll actually just give them to various people who happen to be there at the time when they're taking them off. And it's considered a very auspicious thing to receive some of the robes that the Buddha statue had been clothed in. Actually, I was lucky enough with the group that I was visiting there with, we got given a bolt of cloth from that, which they were all very excited about, and promptly went home and cut them into pieces so that everyone could have a little piece of the cloth. So I have a little square of gold cloth from the Buddha statue in the Mahabodhi temple that I have got with me in my altar at home, just as part of that. So yeah, it's managed. Yeah. Well, if no one else has anything, we are pretty much at time. Thank you for coming along and listening today, and especially those online, thank you for persisting with our technical issues. It's we'll have to get the lowdown on how Nettie makes it work so easily every week. It's clearly a system we're missing somewhere here. But yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed the talk, and yeah, for those of us in the room, we'll go to Tilly's afterwards and continue the discussion.